Hey everyone, Georgie here with Ukraine Matters. After last week's relative silence, this week is just exploding with new news. And if we're talking about explosions, we're gonna start talking about Russia exploding. More specifically, in the last half a week and pretty much every day now, Russians are reporting that one facility has been struck, second facility has been struck, third facility has been struck, Moscow have been struck by drones. And drones are like the places where the drone attacks occur are quite far away from the front line. So that means that Ukrainians have figured out how Russian air defense work. They figured out what to do about it, and they figured out what to strike. Obviously, Russians are always saying that all these strikes are against peaceful residents and that all of these are just terror tactics by Ukraine. But here and there, their BS just surfaces way too much, such as knowing that the building that was struck in the Moscow belongs to their propaganda network, knowing that a recent strike on the factory also had some certain shells scattered around, which obviously wasn't carried by drones. Also, there was a video of another explosion where Russians were just pouring out to the street to see what is happening there and commenting that this explosion is surprisingly close to the military base that is located there locally. All in all, Ukraine is able to strike targets inside Russia, and that is great news. Remember, so far, war has been 100% on the territory of Ukraine, with relative silence on the territory of Russia, if you don't count some certain border incursions. But it is mandatory goal in most military doctrines, in most armies of the world. There is a clear understanding that your job in a war is to move the war from your territory to the territory of your enemy. Because while we support Ukraine and we know that Ukraine is going to win this conflict, we also know that it's Ukraine that's being destroyed. It's Ukrainian people that have to flee areas within Ukraine. It's completely logical and completely understandable that instead of war being on the territory of Ukraine, it would be much better if Russia would fight a war on territory of Russia. And we're all hoping that this will happen later on when Russians will fight Russians, but I'm not betting way too much. Another big news that happened just recently, we know that there is beachhead or breachhead, whichever you like, because technically there is also beaches there and it's a crossing, yada yada, doesn't matter. The point is that we know that there is a little bit of an outpost here from the Ukrainians around Anatomsky Bridge, and Ukrainians are trying to do certain things, but the interesting developments happened around the village of Kazachyi Lakheri over here in the recent couple of days. Russian sources have claimed that it's Ukrainians trying to build up a certain presence in the area, build another beachhead here. However, the situation is not as defined. While Ukrainians are still active in the area, they're still doing their job. It seems that mostly these are special forces, special ops, forces that usually don't carry shovels with them to make any kind of longer term fortifications in the area. What happened is that these special forces, they went over the river, they crossed into about 800 meters into Russian territory. They were able to assault a block, like a guarding post. They were able then to get that some reinforcements being sent to that guarding post and take out the reinforcements, including a major high-ranking officer that also nicely came over to help Ukrainians exterminate more Russians from their territory. Moreover, we know additional details because one of the Russian Telegram channels completely exploded because he had some connections with people inside of this specific unit that got captured. A lot of them got captured, some killed, obviously. And it was absolutely amazing. Ukrainians not only were able to capture Russians, they were able to capture their cell phones with a lot of information, a lot of positions, a lot of intel on them, as he's saying. And additionally, they try to lure in some certain other Russians in to come and assist for help on their positions. So up to right now, which is important, Ukrainians are still active in the area. Yes, Russians have sent reinforcements. They never took the village, but it is still on. What's more importantly here, and I think it's often missed about this story, is that the fact that Russians were having mobile phones is very telling, because the answer why they were having them is because their connections are still bad. If they want to communicate to each other, they are still forced, after 1.5 years of war, after having the shittiest connection of a lifetime at the start of the war, when they were jammed by just regular people by playing Ukrainian anthem on their own radios. Right now, they are literally forced to use cell phones to communicate to each other. And that's the level of Russian communication. In any case, remember that Kherson region still becomes a big indicator for when Ukrainian forces are going to start the next stage of the offensive, something big, because something is going to be happening here. Right now, it is still special forces, but I would still assume that Ukraine would prepare multiple beachheads in the area from which they would try to exert pressure on Russians and then potentially cross with some additional, maybe heavier mechanized forces during the full major push. But again, it's a possibility. I don't know the plan of the Ukrainian armed forces. No one really does. Beyond that, interesting situation is being developing in around the village of Staromayorsky. There are right now reports coming from Urozhaine that supposedly certain units on the flanks, probably around this area, like a little bit more to the east, have failed in defending their positions. And now Russians in Urozhaine are reporting that they are under very, very heavy artillery fire, and that they supposedly are being fired at from all sides. That would suggest that Ukrainians have actually advanced on the side, and now Urozhaine is in the pocket. We will see what's going to happen, but the point is that the news from there are coming, and news are good. And remember, last week it was mostly Russian counterattacks, but this pattern we already seen time and time again, is that Ukrainians advance, they capture some certain either media point or maybe just important objective, and after that Ukrainian generals are like, no, recapture. And for about a week, Russians are throwing as much as they can to try to recapture that point, and then after a week they're like, okay, I think like we're beat. We need to recoup our strengths. And after a week, Ukraine continues resuming that advancement. Another thing that I want to mention about Ukrainian offensive here is that during my last stream, there was a very good question that was asked, is how much reserves Ukraine still has. And while I will not tell you for sure because I don't really know, but generally speaking, as much as I know, is that about a quarter-ish of all available forces were engaged. That includes both people in the southern area, and that includes both people have engaged in the northern area, because this is one thing that I actually must tell you about. This is not a very positive news, but it is how it is. The Russian offensive that they did as a spoiler attack unfortunately succeeded. So this is something we need to recognize, that sometimes we win, sometimes we lose. And Ukrainians, after Russians started already advancing forward, when they saw that the units in that area couldn't really hold, then additional forces have been sent to reinforce that area. So some certain part of reserve was engaged also from Ukrainian side. But remember, Russians almost don't have any reserves here at the back end. as reports are that right now at the back end, they don't have any dedicated reserves. There are still people that are, guarding cities. There are still people and units that are being on patrol. There are still some units recouping procedures, like getting additional forces in. So there are still units that, if push comes to shove, Russia can use. But the point is that dedicated operative reserves are pretty much out. And coming back to the question, there were certain interviews by Ukrainian officials, well, not officials, but more like Ukrainian analysts that are also kind of ranking, where some certain people noted what they were saying. And they said to me, well, Georgie, I've heard that this guy was talking about that about half of Ukrainian troops are engaged. Not completely true. Here, the attention to details matter. What was engaged was elements of half of Ukrainian brigades. So it can be, most often, it is, for example, like an artillery part of that brigade. So it's not only the artillery brigades that is supporting Ukrainian advances, it's not only the artillery of the dedicated artillery of that particular brigade, but it's also artillery pieces from other brigades that are also doing work on certain directions. So certain elements. Then again, from here and there, we also hear that additional elements, for example, armor, like certain tanks from certain like newly formed brigades, are appearing here and there, but not full brigades. So it's a completely, you understand what I'm saying, right? While full brigades have not been engaged, maybe like an artillery piece or maybe additional armor for reinforcement or something like this have been used here and there. That's important thing to recognize when we're saying that half of it was engaged. When we're talking about half engaged, that means that they appeared on the front line. Moreover, even right now, more brigades are finishing their training as it goes along. The training and formation of new brigades never stopped. So even as Ukraine is doing this campaign, they are still training more and more brigades that will help reinforce the push for Ukraine. The long story short, Ukraine still has enough resources to do the push. Now, whether or not it will be like some certain commentators imagine it's going to be like a ride of a Rohirrim or something like this. I'm sorry, I couldn't remember in The Lord of the Rings. Or it's going to be more of a slow and steady progress on very specific, with a lot of pressure on specific directions. But we will still see what's going to happen by the end of September, maybe first week of October. And then we can judge whether or not this campaign was successful or not. Thank you so much for watching this, guys. Thank you so much to the moderator team. Please check out my second channel in the description. The video is coming out tomorrow. And if you can, go to the Terra website, donate some money if you can to the Ukrainian armed forces to help them fight Russians. And if you have a little bit more to spare, you're always welcome to go to buy me a coffee to, well, buy me a coffee. Thank you so much. Slava Ukraini, and I'll see you next time.